Hi, everyone. This is James from the Yin Young Podcast. I just wanted to add to this intro for this podcast with Peter Kageyama, a writer from that we spoke to last year for the release of his first novel, Hunter's Point. In this intro, I just wanted to describe a little bit about there's this photo at the end of his first novel of his father. We mentioned it briefly in this podcast, and I'm going to put it up on the screen here. If you're listening, I'll describe the picture. It's a black and white picture of a young man on his way to internment camp. A young Japanese American man. On his way to the internment camps. And actually, this photo was taken by Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange is a very famous, she's very famous for the taking photos during the Depression era in the U.S. And I was so very surprised about this. So I asked Peter, "Hey, how did you find this photo?" And he mentioned that his family had brought up like finding this photo to him when he was maybe younger, but he didn't really pay much attention to it until like years later when he noticed that there was a the New York Times had a photo collection online about Japanese American internment, and so he clicked on the story, and whoa, he found the photo. So I'm sharing this story, with the with Peter's permission, and yeah, he's like, whoa, there's a picture of my father, and he's found out that there was a show of physical prints of these photos in Washington D.C., and he went out and he reached out to a gallery and got a print of the photo. Unfortunately, he doesn't believe that his father saw the photo, and years later, when he went to visit San Francisco, he actually recreated the photo. And I'll put up the picture there where Peter recreates the photo of his father in San Francisco. And Peter recounted to us that it was probably the worst day of his father's life, having to leave his whole life behind and go to the internment. In this second novel, we return with Kats Takemoto, and we'll listen to this podcast, and we'll give you more in-depth details about this novel, the direction it takes with the characters. And also, one other thing I forgot to mention in this podcast was Feodor Chin. He was a Yin Young Podcast guest right near the beginning of our podcast, and strangely enough, and by very cool coincidence, he's also the voice actor. He voices the audiobooks for Peter's books. So he did the voice acting for Hunter's Point as well as this novel, Midnight Climax. And I think it's very fitting, given that Feo Chin is Asian American. He has Chinese ancestry. So, and with this book, we noticed that there's a lot more focus on Chinatown in San Francisco, and there's a lot more different languages spoken. So I do think it's a very fitting voice acting choice. And without further ado, here's the podcast. All right, welcome back to Yin and Young, the podcast. This is round two, duh, with Peter Kageyama. Yay!
Yay.
Peter Kageyama is a Japanese American writer. He's from Ohio. He's currently on his book tour for Midnight Climax, the second installment of the Kats Takemoto novels that he's coming out with. And I believe there's a third one in the works, according to the last entry of the last book. So very exciting. And so if you haven't listened to our last podcast, we did a podcast with Peter. It was like a year ago, I believe, a year ago.
Just
yes.
over a year ago.
And, yeah. And that was for his first book called Hunter's Point, which details the introduces us to Kats Takemoto and Molly, and also Shig Murao, his what should we say, his trusty sidekick, right?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Sure.
Yeah. And in this book, so in that last book, we were exploring issues with government cover-ups. We're also getting a very inside look into San Francisco and that time period with the beat poetry scene, and also with the growing it becoming a growing center for homosexuals and people, the LGBTQ community. And also we get insight into the kind of like the repercussions of Japanese internment and what
Mhm.
was like coming back. So yeah, if you haven't already, please take a listen to that episode. It's we delve into those topics, and now we're back with this new book. And before we start, how are you doing? How are you feeling?
I'm doing great. It's winter here in Florida, which is really kind of a, oxymoron for folks. It's sunny, it's warm, it's a good time to be in Florida. As a former Ohioan, I was born there. I never thought February could be such a nice month there. So it's actually, yeah, it's a good time, like I said, to be here. So,
Oh, nice.
yeah.
Cool. I'm here in Yokohama, and it just so I moved. So when we last spoke, I was in the Kansai area in the Mie
Yes.
prefecture, yeah. And now I moved last year to this area to be
Okay.
we're closer to my wife's family.
Okay.
And so it snowed like 2 days. It was like 2 days ago.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay.
it's the first snow of the season, and it was just like pretty cool, like seeing
Wow.
like the snow and like and also, but like getting around was treacherous. So no, so we just walked. I had snowshoes. Yeah, yeah. And then Dan, I remember in the last podcast we had with Peter, you mentioned Yokohama was your fave. Is it still your one of your favorite cities?
For me,
For Dan, I mean, Dan
Dan,
mentioned that. Yeah.
For me, yeah, it's Yokohama is still one of my favorite cities. My mom grew up there, so I would like to go back more often, but my mom now lives with me, so that's not going to happen.
yeah.
You know what? It wasn't until I lived here that I realized how big Yokohama is. Peter,
Yeah.
have you visited Yokohama or?
I've been to the area once back when I was an exchange student in high school. So it's like,
Oh,
40 years ago. But my grandparents actually retired. My family, my grandparents were from Chigasaki, which I'm assuming is
Mm,
close to where you're at. Yeah. So,
very cool. Yeah. So let's catch up. How has it? So when we last spoke, you were actually working on this book,
this book, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. If you want to, so there we go, Midnight
yes.
Climax.
Not erotica, believe it or not.
Not
Yes.
erotica. I uh so it so from the last time you said you were like 2/3 of the way through when we were speaking to, and I guess since that time you finished the
Mhm.
book, and how was that process going from like, so you went from your, so well, let's go back to Hunter's point then. Your first fiction book, how was the process promoting that and then moving on towards the second book?
Yeah, all the stuff around, the book, the promotion, doing the interviews and things like that. It's great, but it runs contrary to what you kind of want to do, which is right, especially when you feel like you're getting momentum in a story, and it feels like it was hard to get some of that momentum back. Like I think I said, yeah, we were about 2/3 of the way through that. It came off pretty well. I'm very happy with the end result, but this is sort of at odds with that. I mean, I love talking about it. I love thinking about it in different ways, getting good questions about the material. But it does take away from the actual writing. And this third book is proving to be more of a challenge,
Mm,
first two, it's like you don't know what you don't know. It's like, yeah, of course, let's go write a book. And then you just sort of it happens. Like, oh my God. Then it's like, oh, and then it happened again. And this time it's proving to be a little bit more of a challenge, a little bit more broken up into different timings, and just lots of like personal stuff that's getting in the way, life, but now we were in San Francisco 3 weeks ago, which I think it feels like I've got it back on track in a way.
mm.
We'll see. But yeah, writing is a weird kind of thing. It'd be great if we could summon it on command. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't.
Do you have a process for it? I mean, I know that I've met some writers, and when they have like a deadline of some sort, This one particular writer, he goes to Vegas and books a room for like a week and just
Ooh.
like locks himself into that room. I don't know why Vegas. I don't know if
Yeah,
it's because
that's
of the
like
proximity of things.
I really want to challenge myself to not go out, there because it's like I don't want to be distracted by any of that. No. My process is probably I have a few places that I feel comfortable when I'm writing. Coffee shops, certainly. There's a couple places in the house where I actually feel comfortable writing. Usually out on the porch at night, sitting out there,
Mm.
and headphones to sort of distract, whatever. But yeah, it's again, I don't have a magic, thing. I wish I could say, oh yeah, I'll go to Vegas for a week and lock myself in a room. I don't. I tend to think I would not get good results that way.
Interesting.
Everybody has their own sort of process.
You
So
got to
it's
figure it out. Yeah, whatever works, I think for you. I think to me, it feels more like training for something. I used to do, I used to be a cyclist. I used to do triathlons and stuff
Oh.
like that. And it just was that sort of that regular discipline of like, you're going to swim, you're going to bike, you're going to run, you're going to do this. And you just rinse and repeat. And after a while, it just becomes a habit. I think it's trying to get back into that point where writing becomes a habit again. Because you can fall out of that. And I feel like in the last few months, I've kind of fallen out of that. Again, life happens.
Do you believe in writer's block or like
No.
no?
Figment of your imagination. No, I'm sure it's real for some people. I don't feel blocked. I just feel like the story just hasn't quite revealed itself to me. It's like I'm thinking about it. It's like I know where it's going. I'm just not quite sure how it's going to get there. And then something will click. You'll read something. You'll see something. You'll be watching something else on TV and go, that was an interesting twist. And you go, oh my God, I could use something like that. And it just the pieces, start to fall in place. It's not blocked. It's not that it's not there. It's just it hasn't quite revealed itself yet.
Yeah, I've heard some people talk about writer's block, and yeah, sometimes it becomes like this mythical like monster you have to battle, right?
Yeah.
But in actuality, I do like that analogy of I've done some writing myself. I did screenwriting as my master's, and getting that habit it's like, yeah, like you mentioned, like getting the workout in, getting those words out, even if it's, even if it's just like vomit, like it's like you're just spewing it out, I guess, getting that exercise. But no, that's inspiring, because I think getting back into that groove, it's tough. I've been out of that groove for a while. I've been trying to get back into it myself as well, but for yourself, do you have a maybe not so much as a process, but like a routine? Like you have to have, like, some people are very like
Yes.
neurotic about it, like, oh, okay, the hot water has to be here, I have to have my cup of coffee, and then, like, do you have a like spacing, the desk has to be arranged, like, do you have anything like that or no?
I usually do need a beverage. I need my noise canceling headphones, block out everything except whatever is playing. I think, being comfortable, is a good comfort, good seating, good lighting. If I'm in a coffee shop, I like the distraction of the coffee shop. You see other people, but you don't really see them. You kind of hear this sort of white noise of conversation that's going on. That's fine. It's almost, it sort of puts you into that, whatever, the zone, ideally, there. But I think more or less, I'm gravitating more and more towards wanting to write at home. And right now it's proving to be a little bit of a challenge. My wife and I are in the process of selling our condo. We purchased another place together. We just got married about a year and a half ago. So pre-construction, we purchased a new place, and it's actually very close to where we live now. But it's kind of been disruptive because we're in the process of consolidating stuff, putting a lot of stuff into storage, and then showing your place, which is a whole other thing, making it ready, stripping it down. And it doesn't feel like I live here anymore. It feels like I'm sort of like, it's like I'm in a showroom now. We had a showing today. I had to get out of the house for, a couple of hours, and then everything just has to be pristine. It's like, oh my God, it's like, I don't feel quite like I live here right now. And that is kind of unsettling, because this is the place where I want to write. But it's proving to be, it's like, yeah. I'll get over it. But at the moment, it is just a little weird. I don't know if you've ever gone through the process of trying to sell a home. It's yeah, it's a whole thing. My wife has done it several times, and I'm following her lead. But like I said, it just doesn't feel. I'm not comfortable. Let's put it that way. In the same way that, when you feel like when you feel like you want to write, you feel like you're in a comfortable, sort of space. It hasn't felt like that lately. So,
And then
woohoo,
what is the
yeah.
what is real estate market like in Florida? I'm sorry, it's getting a little derailed, but what is it? I mean, I'm just trying to anticipate how long it's going to be like just for you to sell your place in order to move into it.
Ideally, yeah. Florida real estate, especially in some of the bigger cities. I live in St. Petersburg. It has not really cooled off much at all. There's still a very strong market here. So, and February, March, April are the high season for sales. We're optimistic that we will sell relatively soon. And then we have the other problem of basically being homeless for a few months until the other place is ready. But we'll jump off that bridge when we get there. So
gotcha. I noticed the artwork. Is that the same artwork you had last time? Is that a famous
no,
piece for you?
He's a Filipino artist by the name of Tony Etheron. My wife is a big fan of his. He's based here in Florida. He's been around for several decades. She's got several pieces by him, but he does beautiful work at scale sometimes. So she's introduced this artist to her sister and several other people as well. Tony Etheron. Yeah.
Okay, check it out. So for this I guess going back to the first book, Hunter's Point. So in Hunter's Point, we deal with like government cover-up of like the nuclear contamination, the real nuclear contamination of Hunter's.
It really was, yes.
Yeah. And Hunter's Point. And there's a sense of, it's an interesting dynamic that you paint because Katsushiro Takemoto, he was this fictional character that's loosely based off, some stories you've mentioned of your father, and then and
several other, a lot of those guys from the 442nd and
442nd. Yep. So he's this very decorated soldier that served his country very bravely.
Yes.
And then in these books, he's going against the government, in a way. Yeah. So it's an interesting, for me at least, it's an interesting dynamic. I was wondering if you could speak to that. Is that, I guess there's the first, betrayal, is what I'm trying to, is a word that comes to mind. There's the Executive Order 9066. And that's the order for Japanese Americans during World War II to be interned. And so that's the betrayal of the country to the people. And then in turn, but then the government asks the young boys, hey, yes or no, do you want to serve? And then there was the gung-ho people, the 42nd. Yes, I want to prove myself as an American. Go for broke. And then there's the no boys who he mentioned in your new book. I mentioned it in our last interview. So you actually read it. I'm so
in fact, that was a nice takeaway from our last conversation. Is I did read it, and it's kind of brilliant. It's very sad in some ways.
Yeah.
That's a whole other story about Okada himself, but I think it stands as a testament of like sort of conscientious objection or dissent. Conscientious dissent, I think, is a better way to put it. The no boys were incredibly principled about what they did, and I think Kats is also very principled. He decides, as you say, he does go and is the good soldier. But it seems to me that he's not anti-government at all. I think what he is calling to task in both books is when the government fails to live up to its own ideals. When the government is supposed to take care of the soldiers and the people, that where you work shouldn't be poisoning you, shouldn't be killing the environment and potentially, shortening your life. That the government shouldn't be running brothels and dosing, people who come in, having prostitutes dose Johns with psychedelic drugs and just to sort of experiment on them to see what would happen. And, to me, those are those are the bigger betrayals because they're betraying our ideals as a country.
So for these, so then, so Katz is not anti-government, but
No.
he's anti-evil, I guess, or
I guess
anti.
I say it a couple times in the books. Katz doesn't like bullies. I don't think he
Right,
doesn't like
yeah.
people who he doesn't like power that's trying to get away with something and then covering it up. I think that offends him, at his core. I think it offends most of us at our core when the people in power abuse that power to their own ends or to suspect ends. I mean, we could debate whether or not Midnight Climax, which was the actual CIA operation around this. That's where the title
Right.
comes. Whether or not that was justified, because they thought that the Chinese and the Russians were doing sort of mind experiments as well. Therefore, we as a government have to do that in order to keep up. I think in hindsight, it's bullshit, but in 1959, the height of the Cold War, maybe, that perspective looks a little different. I don't know.
Right. So yeah, as Peter mentioned, it's not erotica, but there are some erotic scenes there.
There's a couple, yeah.
There's a for
So I guess
writing. Yeah, go
it's
ahead,
more
Dan.
about the hypocrisy of it all, right? So
Good word.
we
Yeah.
we portray America as this great shining on democracy, and we are, we're the heroes of the story. But in reality, there are a lot of things there are a lot of flaws in what we do. And
Yeah.
even now, it's kind of like that. And then I know that Katz is very drawn to people who are just like him, very principled, like the officer Blackburn and such.
Blackstone, yes.
Blackstone.
Who was a real guy too. I discovered that in my research. So
Oh,
yeah, Elliot Blackstone is a cop in the book. And I discovered him reading about this because he was one of the first police officers in San Francisco in the early 1960s. He was assigned to work with the gay community. This is revolutionary at the time.
right.
And he, was a religious man, and he was a straight religious man, but he was a very community-minded person. And in fact, after he retires, he ends up being the head of the Grand Marshal at the Pride Parade in the early 2000s. I thought that's a wonderful sort of full circle on something like that. That there were, elements of there were the beginnings of that sort of understanding of different types of communities, and that's what kind of comes across, I think, in this particular book. And Elliot is going to be actually in the third book. He makes another appearance there as well because he's an interesting character. And like Shig Murao, he was a real guy from that time period.
I don't believe I asked this last time, but when writing historical figures, do you have to pass anything legally? Do you have to talk to one? No.
As I was told by friends who are lawyers, and if you look it up, basically just make sure you write about dead people. That's kind of the yeah. But again, I also don't want to. I mean, these people still have. I'm sure they still have family.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was interesting because Shig's grand niece, she and I connected on Instagram.
Oh wow.
And so I sent her and her father, who would be Shig's nephew, copies of the book. Unfortunately, I've never heard back from her. It's like I need to follow up with her on that. Hey, it's like, did I do your great uncle justice here? I hope I did. Well, haven't had a cease and desist, thing from or anything like that. So, but it would be kind of nice to. I'd really actually like to talk to her father, who was Shig's nephew. That would be pretty cool. Thank you. Reminding for reminding me of that. I will follow up with her on that.
Yeah,
How
that's
did she
something
reach
I
out
thought
to
about.
you?
Yeah.
Yeah, how did she reach
Instagram.
out to you? Instagram, I know that part, but I mean, is
I
it just
actually
like, hey,
found there was a post on Instagram, and it was about Shig. It was something about the Howl and the obscenity trial that he was part of.
right.
And of course, I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I looked at some of the comments, and there was this woman says, oh yeah, that was my uncle. It's like, what? It's like, so, and I looked her up, and it turns out it's her great uncle. So it would, yeah, because she's in her probably late 20s, I think, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's how we connected. It's like, so read your comments, because occasionally there's something really interesting in there. And it's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea.
Okay. It was a post that you did on Shig Murao,
It
or
wasn't even a post that I did. I think it might
oh,
have been Densho or something like that.
okay.
Post. And I follow them obviously on Instagram. They put out a lot of great content, and something about Shig. It must have been like an anniversary maybe of the trial. Something came up, and there was, a number of comments, there, and I just happened to notice that one about, oh yeah, that was my uncle. It's like, crazy.
That's great.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, Shig Murao was he worked at the City Lights bookstore in San Francisco, and he's famously known as the poor guy who sold Hal's Allen Ginsberg's Howl to a undercover FBI agent, and then was
Yes.
embroiled in a trial about free speech. And
Obscenity charges.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, so with Hunter's Point, we're introduced to Kats, Molly, Shig, and also the government cover up there about the nuclear waste, and also land grabs and extortion, kidnapping. For the second book, what was your for the first book? It was kind of, I guess, let's start with the first. For your first book, you had the story, and you were in love with the city of San Francisco, and you wanted to explore that time, that such a very interesting time and place. And how did you want to shift to the second book? You're still based in San Francisco.
Yes.
I'm curious about what. So for that first book, we talked about your reasons for writing that, but what made you kind of like take maybe a different turn in this book?
Yeah. This one was more, I fell in love with those characters, Kats and Molly and Shig, and I wanted to revisit them. I wanted to know more about them. And so I did, started to dig into that. As you said, San Francisco was sort of the emphasis, or the impetus for the first book. The second one is a deeper dive into Kats and Molly and Shig, especially Kats. Part of the deep dive had to do with what was the effect on guys like him of the war. He was wounded, and he was decorated in this, bloody incident, and we recount that in the book, but they didn't call it PTSD back then. They called it battle fatigue, shell shock. And it really was not a well-diagnosed or well-understood sort of condition. But I'm sure so many guys were suffering from that. And this time I was able to talk to a really good friend of mine, who's actually my wife's best friend. And she's a clinical psychiatrist. And she actually used to work at the VA hospital here in St. Petersburg. In fact, she ran the VA hospital here in St. Petersburg. And so I got to really interview and discuss with her what PTSD is like. What would these soldiers be like? And I actually let her read an early version of the story to help me say, would this be a real conversation? Would they really do this? And she gave me, like, here's the way a doctor would actually talk to his patient. They wouldn't do this. They would do this. You can't say that. Okay. And she really helped me understand that condition. And I hope that comes across sort of authentically, because it's not only Kats, it's actually one of the new characters that we actually meet in this story is another soldier who's been violently abused and experimented on. And he is kind of he's the ticking time bomb in this. And of course, how he deals with that is part of, the challenge that he and Kats both have. Of trying to overcome these inner wounds that the war and unfortunately other people inflicted upon them.
Well, like research, what kind of research did you delve into for this? So it sounds like you researched PTSD with your wife's friend who's very familiar, who works in that field. What about like specifically Chinatown? Dan and I are of Asian, my family's from Taiwan, but I know for Chinatown in San Francisco, a lot of the early immigrants were from like Taisan, or from Hong Kong, Guangdong, like Canton, and then so I was curious. There's the Chinatown makes a much bigger presence in the second book, and I was curious about the research there, especially into the Tongs and the relationships there.
I credit in the first book, and I credit that again the organization in the second book. There's an organization called San Francisco City Guides, and they do these amazing tours all over the city. And I reached out to them again, and they connected me with this husband and wife who kind of both do tours, but they took me through Chinatown. And we walked into alleys, and he was telling me stories about, okay, this was this, and those alleys actually appear in the book, Ross Alley, Cooper Alley, and sort of there's the obvious side of Chinatown. You walk around, you see this, but then we walked into some of these back alleys, and that was where stories about the Tong really, he started to fill in sort of the history around that. Then you dig deeper into that on my own. But yeah, it's again, you walk there, you smell it, you see it, you hear it. It's like, okay, this is, how do I bring this place to life? Yeah, you're right. Chinatown is a much bigger part of this story.
So for the language, so in the first book we were introduced to the word so Dan, you speak a little bit of Cantonese, right? Or
A little bit, yes.
okay. So like guai is it guai po?
Yeah.
Guai po. So
White
it's like
devil woman.
white devil woman, or like guai is like character for devil, and then po is like older woman, or yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so that term is mentioned. I'm curious to understand, like linguistically, like how, because you introduce, like in your first book as well, you introduce Japanese, irashaimase, and like on and giri, and you also mentioned that again in this book. What was like the language research, and when do you throw those in? Because those little bits, I think, help make the world more authentic. Specifically, especially for me, who's like I enjoy language. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, there's an amazing tool out there. It's, Wikipedia, and seriously following, the trail down there, and then finding that terminology. I'd love to say where, I don't even remember where I found guaipo. It might have even been in some other novel. It's like, and then you look it up, go, oh my God, that's a great word. It's like, how do I end up using that? But yeah, I think being curious, digging deeper, and it's like following it's like, oh, this, and following the history, and then reading more about this particular character, and it just makes for a deeper sort of understanding of it. I don't claim to be an expert on certainly on linguistics or language, or history or cultural anthropology, any of that stuff. It's like I find enough to make what I think is a good story, and hopefully folks will generally agree.
Do you make a distinction with like Mandarin and Cantonese, or which characters speak Mandarin, which characters speak Cantonese?
Yeah, I wish no, not so much. I think when I was looking at those words, I was conscious of the fact that most of the immigrants had come through, or at least at that time would have come through Hong Kong. So it is more Cantonese. So when you look for those words, yeah, I think I was looking for Cantonese, not English to Cantonese, not English to Mandarin.
That might be tougher to find, because Cantonese, yeah, it's a little bit, it's not as prominent. It's still very prominent, but it's not as prominent as like finding databases for like Mandarin per se. Because I noticed like sometimes it'd be mixed, but which is fair, because I do know that there are a lot of some Cantonese speakers who also speak Mandarin as well. Because like Dan, like I think your family, they can mix between the two, right?
Right. Yeah, my family, they immigrated through Hong Kong, and so and they lived in Hong Kong for a period of time, but they can speak both. They definitely have an accent. They don't have the northern accent of northern Chinese people,
Oh,
where
right.
they curl their tongues when they have the R's. So
Beijing, or
yeah,
or
they sound more like Chow Yun Fat and Michelle Yeoh than they do Jet Li when he speaks Mandarin.
right. Yeah, one thing. So going back to Midnight Climax, so there's like there are some scenes with, so I think it's difficult, I think, for writers, especially like in modern times, because when you write about minorities, there's always a sense of like, okay, let's not tokenize these minorities, let's not exoticize them. So where do you find that fine line? Because there
Yeah.
is a history of Asian female fetishization, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there is a sexualization of Asian females. You know, part of that is due to World War II. There are, you know,
Mhm.
unfortunately there were many Japanese women who had to take up the job
Mhm.
in order to survive, to provide for their families in post-war in a decimated Japan.
Yeah.
So there are some, you know, and then there's war bride and stuff like that. So
Oh, yeah.
how do you as a writer, do you navigate that? You don't think about it too much. You just try to respect each character. I'm curious about that because
Yeah.
there is a dead prostitute, female
Yeah.
Asian American prostitute in this
Yeah.
book, and that's always I remember seeing that in like this movie, was it like Dirty Little Secrets or something like that? And it was shown to me in like Asian American class, right? And
Yes, I
the
know which
prof
movie. Yeah, from like
yeah,
20 years ago, something like
right,
that.
right,
Yeah,
from a
yeah,
long
yeah.
time ago,
Mhm.
and we've come a long way from that. But like I remember my Asian American professor, studies professor, saying like, okay, this is an example of Asian American fetishization. But I'm not saying you're doing that. I'm curious about how you write in such a way
Yeah.
to maybe not to play into those things. Yeah.
Well, the character in order for the Tong to be involved, the character who died had to be Chinese. So there was
Right.
that. Um, I actually kind of poked fun at that well, not poke fun. I consciously wrote about that because in the book they talk about, there's this again, a Chinese prostitute. It's being observed by the CIA agents who are running this, this drug operation essentially. And they call her Susie. And I make the note that it had to do with The World of Susie Wong, which had come
Yes.
out right around that time. And it was, if you remember, it was a Broadway play, and then it eventually became a movie. And it was about sort of the exotic Asian women. And these two white CIA officers are talking about that, and they call her Susie. And it's sort of derogatory. And I thought by pointing that out, it kind of took away from, again, as an Asian man writing, about a kind of a stereotype. Yeah, I was conscious of that. But again, in order to make the story work, because of who she is connected to,
Yeah.
it leads to the next part of the story. But you're right, there is that sort of the fetishization. It's late here. But there's also at the corresponding for men, there's the neutering of Asian males, right?
Right.
And the old adage is Bruce Lee gave balls back to a whole generations of of Asian men there. And I think in his own way, Kats is kind of like that. He's not he's not overly aggressive or anything like that, but he's not meek when it comes to standing up for himself. So I think that you try to be authentic to the characters, give them something beyond a cultural stereotype
Sure.
there. I hope I did that. I hope that the Asian prostitute thing is not too much. The other thing I will say is I am conscious of the fact that at that time, this book takes place in like 1959. The word Oriental would have been used a lot, and I only
Right.
use it a couple times. And I try to use Asian because I think it is more. It sounds better to me now, but I fully get that at the time they would have been saying Oriental. And there's a point where I talk about Indian trails, and I make a note in a footnote. It says, apologies, to the the Native American population of Northern California. At the time, they would have said this, so I'm conscious of it.
Right. I guess
Yeah.
because it's a period piece, you have to be authentic to the period, and let's be real, it's
Maybe gives me a
pretty
little more
racist.
latitude. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there were, cultural norms were very different. There you could say things. It's like there's no way you could say that now. And it was
Right.
just said in so-called polite society. Yeah.
Right. I remember in the first book you mentioned, yeah, the war brides. Oh, it's you could, Asian white mixes. Yeah, white
Yeah,
guys with Asian women. That was becoming into like
yes,
now it's like super norm here, but that was like that was kind of weird, but not as weird as seeing an Asian man with a white woman.
yes, yeah,
Right.
which was very transgressive.
Right.
And that was my parents. So and that was how I sort of incorporated that idea into the books, because I always thought my parents, were well ahead of their time. In the early 1960s in Ohio, an Asian man and a white woman. Yeah.
Mm. And did they I'm assuming they did, but did they come across incidents similar to the first, like probably not as violent as the first book, but they
Yeah.
probably came across some stuff, like some
My
racist
dad, again,
comments. Yeah.
my dad never really talked about that. My mom said that, yeah, that she was very conscious of, people there, of people looking, at
Uh,
her. And even, there were people who said they worried about, what about your children was some stuff. And she, yeah, so, how are they going to grow up? Like, yeah. So,
well,
yeah,
here you are.
and here I am. I was the only mixed race Asian kid in probably in 100 miles, in Akron, Ohio, but somehow we made it through.
That's good. Oh, me, and you have a third degree black belt, right? So that, and you're 6'2", so that helps, right?
It helps, yeah, being a little taller and athletic, and yeah, of course, yeah. And I guess it was. I mean, let me ask you guys a question. Growing up,
Sure.
you kind of, it's like, is it expected as an Asian guy, you learn martial arts at least at some point, in your life? Because I think it kind of felt expected. I mean, I was exploring, I was looking for that, because again, I was this, there was only a couple other Asian kids, in my entire school. So I was actually trying to connect with some of these Asian things, and martial arts was one way to do it. But
Mm.
I'm wondering if you guys felt that sort of like, is it expected? Are you supposed to learn, kung fu or
Mm.
karate?
You want to go first, James?
Sure. For me, my father made it a point that I should learn how to defend myself. And
Yeah.
like, and at a young age, he's like, James, you want to learn to be able to defend yourself, not fight people, but like defend yourself. So he
Yeah.
signed me up actually for Shotokan karate,
Mhm.
not kung fu or anything. And he signed me. There was a school not too far from my house, so I did that, and I was like, it's all right, it's kind of fun, and I quit. And then like I tried swimming in middle school and some other sports, but I wasn't really like good at sports like American, American sports.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I kind of miss karate. So I went back to karate in high school. And then ever since then, I've kept up with martial arts. And I think just the confidence of knowing that, maybe you're not the best fighter of obviously, but that you can hand yourself in a fight
Yes.
in more than the average population is very, it gives you confidence, right? And Bruce Lee, of course, we don't Asian American men don't have too many idols, but he's definitely one of them, and he's
Absolutely.
definitely give gave a lot of people, not just Asian men, but a lot of people in general, like inspiration or curiosity into looking into martial arts. Because I remember one phrase he mentioned, and obviously he's not a perfect character. There's biographies about him and about his infidelity, stuff like that. But
Yeah.
he and but in his good light, he did mention how like martial arts, his for his health and his his career, all those things he owes to martial arts, the discipline he learned
Yeah.
from it,
Yeah.
and also the mental stability. So that's something I've always thought of. I thought of martial arts not so much as a just a physical practice, but a practice of perfecting character. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And discipline. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, for myself, it was more like an external stereotype that I've experienced because you're Chinese. Oh, you must know Kung Fu because that's all
Right.
anyone associated
Right.
with being Chinese, that and Chinese food. And for myself, um, it's because of my upbringing, being a latchkey kid, and my father being, my parents divorcing, all that stuff. So I watched a lot of kung fu movies growing up,
Yeah.
especially because they were very accessible, and those were something that my grandparents were like, "Oh yeah, go ahead and watch it because it's Chinese and it's all in Chinese anyways." And I grew up thinking, "Oh, that's like, oh." I can be kind of like a superhero with all those feats that they can do. And I always wanted and gravitated towards martial arts. And when my mom finally let me go take classes, that's when I started taking it more than
Yeah.
anything else. It's just like a
Mm,
cultural identity that I was like, oh, it's a very positive sort of cultural identity that was not untouchable, but with Chinese food back in the 70s and 80s, they go, oh, what's that kind of
Yeah.
thing, that reaction, that smell, or whatever it is. But with martial arts, no one can say, oh, Kung Fu, that's such a bad thing, or it's a stereotype in a positive way that I kind of gravitated towards.
mm,
So there you go. That it's probably pretty common amongst, guys like us, that it's the stereotype that you want to gravitate, towards, because I think it was a way to kind of connect with, something that was hard to find, at least for me.
mm. I noticed you use some kung fu in this book, so which is good, which is fun, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You're right about some kung fu, which is always fun. For like those who are not familiar with some of the topics in this book, from like so in this book you talk about MK Ultra, mind
Mhm.
control, or
Yeah.
and kind of like I guess what super soldier experiments kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Can you give maybe without giving like too much
Sure.
detail away about the book, but can you give us a little bit about kind of the premise and the background for this
Yeah.
second book? Yeah.
So
And
MK Ultra was a real CIA government operation. It started in the 1950s. It goes into the 1970s, and it was this attempt to use drugs, mostly psychedelic drugs, psychotropic drugs, to try to do mind control or potentially like truth serum, all that stuff. But really, it was about mind control because there was this feeling that the Russians and the Chinese were experimenting with these things, and we had to keep up. So that was the overarching sort of program, and it was done to prisoners, soldiers, criminals. It was pretty pervasive, but some of it was even done right out in the open, and that's actually part of the story. Is that the government through some pharmaceutical companies was doing experiments on people, and you could volunteer for these at hospitals and at some universities. They were doing that because
wow.
psychedelic drugs like LSD wasn't even illegal, I think, until like 1966. So
Mm.
imagine that there. And so you see people volunteering, including a character that was a real person who's in the book, Ken Kesey, the guy who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He was experimenting with this while he was a grad student at Stanford there. So that was MK Ultra. Midnight Climax was a small subset of that, and it was this even more insidious program, and it took place in New York and in San Francisco, where the CIA used prostitutes and they controlled these brothels, and these girls would lure Johns in, and they would dose them unbeknownst to that. So they weren't criminals, they weren't soldiers, they weren't foreign agents or anything like that. They were American citizens,
Mm.
and this was the government kind of just absolutely fucking with them. And it was late, of course, all this is later discovered through a fluke in the Freedom of Information Act, because the CIA actually tried to cover up the entire thing. In the 1970s, I forget the guy who was the CIA director at the time, ordered all of the records to be just destroyed, right?
Mm.
Unfortunately, because of a misfiling, apparently, some 20,000 documents were misfiled in whatever records thing. And then during a public records search, those were discovered. It's like, oh my God, this is what they've been doing. And the CIA had to come clean on that. So yeah, this is
Wow.
real stuff that was really done to people. And when you read about stuff like that, and that background has been used by a lot of other authors and content creators, movies, because it's fascinating because it really happened there. And then the whole super soldier thing was me sort of riffing on the idea of Captain America. Why not? I love
Mm.
comic books. What would happen if one of those experiments kind of worked? Except it worked in a way that wasn't as what they had expected. And that's where we get the character of Stephen Epps
Mm.
in the book. And I'll leave folks to imagine what that does. But yeah, he's been experimented upon, and he's become something very, very dangerous.
Mm. I, it makes me like, wow. So just a misfiling? That's kind of
Yeah.
that's crazy.
Something
Yeah.
otherwise we would never have known. So this stuff was, this information was misfiled, and somehow again, a freedom of information, dump, they found it. And it led to, they found out about the cover up.
That makes me wonder, like, what else is not being, like, what was not misfiled, like,
Just ask Oliver Stone about the whole JFK thing, so,
oh,
that's the kind of stuff that, the conspiracy theorists love to sort of pour over. But there's probably, evidence would suggest there is probably a hell of a lot more that we don't know as ordinary citizens,
right.
that's sort of being kept from us. Not to sound too, too Illuminati or anything like that.
Right, right. Tinfoil hat, yeah.
Yeah, but it does make for interesting storytelling.
For yourself, for like, as far as kind of like an ethos or a through line for your writing, are you uh are you, I guess, in Kats mentions like he doesn't like bullies. Is that sort of something, I guess, what are some lessons or themes that you feel like are important to you in your writing that hopefully you get across? Do you think about like, or you just want to write a good story and entertain people, or but like, or is there some through line that you're also trying to do at the same time?
The through line for me with these characters is about love and friendship. The Kats and Molly and Shig, they really do love each other. You have this, obviously, the male female sort of bond that we're very used to in stories, but there's this very real sense of friendship I hope comes through between Kats and Shig, because they went through some really tough times together. They were in camp together, and that was the core of my father's relationships with his two best friends for the throughout his adult life were two guys he was in camp with, and I wanted to respect that. And because again, those are formative years, and you go through something like that together, you're bonded for life. And I hope that comes through with that, because I that to me was important. And I'm a big believer. I have friends, it's kind of unusual. My wife says this. I have friends people that I've been friends with since like grade school and middle school, high school, that I'm still very, very close to. And I know most people lose track of their friends from high school. It's like, oh, I got one buddy from high school and I got a couple friends from college. I feel like I've known some extraordinary people for a very long time, and I don't necessarily just want to let them go. So I think that for me, the idea of maintaining friendships over time, that for me is personally important. And I will try to convey that through Kats as well.
I know you mentioned like your father was a very big inspiration for this character, and it was very surprising to see in the last book, like Dorothea Lange, a very famous black and white. She did photos for during the Great Depression. She's most famous for the migrant mother photo, and then, but she took a picture of your dad.
Yes.
Wow. That's amazing.
I even have it. It's in the index of the end notes of the book. It's in the National Archives, so it was public record. I could use it. You can kind of see it right there. Yeah,
so that's my dad. That's Mr. Kageyama. Okay.
That was in April of 1942. Dad was reporting to an assembly center on Van Ness Boulevard in San Francisco. You're allowed to bring 2 suitcases, and it's the worst day of his life. Yeah.
Cool. So for wrapping this up, I had a question about it's interesting that we look at your book now, it's a period piece, but even today there is very strong and national tension international tension between China, Russia, America. And what we've seen during the pandemic with anti-Asian hate and also like things happening to our communities, it's interesting to see how like these ghosts of the past still come to visit us, right? Racism and scapegoating. What are your thoughts, I guess, on current, like how is something that you hope your books or your writing or your personal work outside of writing, you hope could help maybe make today a better place, or
Yeah.
yeah, because yeah, I do think about that. It's like, okay, now China's the big bad, even with like that Senate hearing, he's like, are you from China? He was asking the CEO of TikTok,
Foreign,
the
right? Yeah.
Singaporean. It's like, no, I'm Singaporean, and he had to keep repeating himself. And it seems like, okay, this guy's kind of bullying,
Mhm.
bullying this CEO. Now there is a place to be asking, oh, does he have a connection with China? There is a place for that. But I think the tone, the attitude, the way it's presented, it's
Yeah.
like you can't talk to people like that. It's messed up. So I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts about that kind of stuff.
I think you can use fiction to tell great, use it as to teach a lesson in a way that sometimes you can't through nonfiction or through explaining to people. It's like trying to convince them of something. A story wraps the thing that you're trying to do in this cocoon of something that somehow makes it maybe more powerful and more palatable at the same time. We remember good stories, remember good characters. And if anything, people remember, hey, that guy Kats, that's a cool character, really interesting guy. And it maybe changes the way they felt about, an Asian character. It's like, oh, maybe not so stereotypical. And the way he dealt with other people, and that there were gay characters in this thing. There were Chinese characters. There were, there was, we talk about this. I had the mafia in the first one. So I guess, we're talking cultural stereotypes here. Sorry, Italian American. But again, these were they were real people at the time. So, yeah, if you can use a good story to, underscore, it's like, hey, be better people to each other. Yeah, let's do that. I'm all for that. And, at the end of the day, I want to tell a good story. But I'd like to do it in a way that, that I feel ethically responsible about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Dan,
Yes.
did you have anything you want to ask?
Well, we can take that my question offline. It's about the groups that formed because of the internment camps. I don't know if you're aware. Well, I'll ask anyways.
Sure.
My younger son's actually into basketball, and he joined this league, this basketball league that was formed from the internment camps because there are a lot of sports.
Mhm.
And for the longest time, you can only be Japanese and be in this league, or Japanese American in this league. Are you aware of these basketball groups?
No, but that's kind of fascinating. I mean, I mentioned in the background of, Kats' story that he was a baseball player because he was an athletic
Right.
kid, and that he played baseball in camp. Because I
Right.
was aware that there was a lot of they tried to make camp as normal as possible, and that included, sports, especially for the young men. So yeah, there must have been a baseball, or like you said, basketball teams. But the fact that there's basketball teams that are still Japanese American only 70 years later, it's like, how did that happen?
Yeah, I remember playing in a league up in the Bay Area, and they had a restriction that only like 3 people who could be of non-Japanese descent be on the
Okay.
team.
Really?
So I'm pretty sure it was like something that came out of the internment camps
Yeah.
because the Chinese groups, there are no Chinese groups like that at all, and these are leagues.
I would say that's maybe not the healthiest, legacy for something like that.
Yes.
They talk about there's what's called social capital, and there's inward facing and outward facing social capital. The outward facing is the best kind. That's when we're open and we're accepting of other people. We want to interact with other folks. That's the really good kind. The kind that gets a little insidious is when it turns inward and we find and we start taking our cues from each other. A lot of churches become like this. Religion is one of those things that bonds people. It's like it's us against them. When you start looking inward, that kind of social capital can become kind of dangerous. And that league sounds a little bit borderline in terms of the way it's approaching that. It's like, well, we can have 3 non-Japanese guys, but they all have to be over 6'8" kind of thing. So
Yeah.
that was maybe a way around that.
Well, you speak Japanese, Dan, so you can yeah. That's
Yeah,
probably a plus.
ironically,
You can fake it, sure. Yeah.
yeah, they ask for birth certificates though, but
Wow.
yeah, I was the only one who could actually speak Japanese on my team, though.
Well, that should be like, it's like you should get a special dispensation for that. So,
Right.
yeah.
I wonder about that too. Is like, sure, there are there's like Asian American film festivals. There are, Asian American writing workshops, and I wonder about this capital that you mentioned, because I think we see that in other communities where like maybe they don't have uh, a title to the group, but they help each other out. Certain communities
Yes.
help each other out.
Oh, absolutely.
You see that with maybe, yeah, particularly maybe the Jewish community after World War II. They help each other out. When in the New York, there's the textile industry there,
Mhm.
and that they would help each other out. The Italian families, Irish families would help each other out.
Chinese
And
family.
what's that?
Chinese families coming to the
Chinese
West Coast.
families.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably in your research, like Chinatown was formed because
Yes.
no one else would let them live anywhere else, right? They had to
Exactly.
they had to live in these ghettos. And
Mhm.
so it's interesting. I think there is a line, I guess, where it becomes just racist, but I think there is still a place for ethnic groups, if you know what I mean, like
Oh,
as far as
absolutely.
social groups in like festivals, film festivals, writing groups, stuff like that. Yeah.
From understanding your history, understanding who your ancestors were. Yeah, absolutely. There's value to that.
Mm.
Again, I think that there at some point it can become maybe a little unhealthy.
Right.
But again, I think again it's a question of degree. And
Right.
but yeah, the basketball thing, that's kind of funny.
Yeah, I wasn't
70
sure if you
years
were
later,
aware of
it's
it. Yeah.
interesting.
Oh, but I mean, my kids group is actually opened up quite a bit.
Yeah.
There's only like a few who are of Japanese descent, but I know that when I was growing up, I knew that about these leagues, and there are still some other basketball leagues that are primarily Japanese Americans in
Mm.
LA. So
Hmm.
yeah,
That's
I was just
yeah. Oh.
yeah,
And that's echoes of the internment camps, I guess.
I believe
yeah,
so. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
That's
pretty much.
interesting.
And then the other thing, we were talking recently with another psychologist, and I was curious because we were talking about our perception of the homeland and
Mhm.
those ideas and stuff like that. And she had mentioned that Asian Americans are actually a lot more strict than the the, the parenting of the Japan or China or wherever
Hmm.
you're from.
Okay.
And I was wondering if your dad had those ideas and ideals, and if you were able to see and contrast, if when you went back to Japan, oh, they're not quite what I pictured them to be, or
Right.
Japanese people, because
Yeah.
your dad came back or immigrated from to America at a certain period of time in
Dad was
Japan.
born in San Francisco. His
Oh,
parents
well,
came
his
over. Yeah,
parents,
yeah,
yeah,
but he was born to Japanese parents. Yeah.
right. So the idea is like, oh, that idea of Japan, it becomes like a snapshot of
Yeah.
like what Japan is, and if those values were passed on, and I don't know if if you had the opportunity to actually see, the way your idea of Japan is and how Japanese people should be versus how they really are now, because
Yeah.
every culture evolves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, my dad was not particularly strict compared to like I know a lot of Asian parents were. 'Cause I had a couple of friends and their parents who were very strict. My dad was a little looser than that. But again, he's
Right,
still an Asian parent. It's like,
right,
you expected to do good in school, you expected to go to college, expected to be a doctor, lawyer, or an engineer, right?
Mm.
That kind of stuff. Um, so my perception though of what I thought, Asian parents and what, the homeland was, through books and media and whatnot. But I was in high school, I was an exchange student to Japan. And what that underscored to me was how American I actually was. Because you go there and
mm,
think, oh, because I don't look like the other, kids in my school. I don't look like, anybody else around here. There's a couple other Asian faces. It's like, oh, I must be different. It's like, no, you go over there, you are American. And
right,
that was very eye-opening. It was actually, I think it was very good for me too, because it actually kind of put some things into balance, there. You grew up, thinking you're different. You realize, I may look a little different, but I am very much an American. And that I
Mm.
think is actually and ultimately that was a really good lesson to learn.
Mm. Whoa.
Well,
So, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
no, I just want to respect your time because I know it's pretty late in Florida.
I appreciate that. That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we do have I mentioned in our email like we
Yes.
usually end with like two questions we ask all our
I
guests.
saw that. Yep.
Yeah. So one of the first questions is you mentioned last time that board games was a great hobby of
Yeah.
yours that kept you kind
Yeah.
of balanced. So for you nowadays, what else do you do that helps, in your day to day keep you balanced? I'm assuming you're still very much in love with board games. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I played a 5-hour game this afternoon. I just,
Oh my.
got back around 8:30 with a friend of mine. It's the 100 Years War in, 4.5 hours. Like, yeah, it's very good. I still love that. I'm getting, as I feel like I'm getting older, I feel like staying very fit is still
Mm,
kind of a priority. So that is the other thing I try to balance it out with is being very disciplined about working out and staying on top of that. Because I know that will pay benefits for hopefully many, many years to come.
mm,
And all that. So I think that the balance between the body, the mind through gaming, which is to me is a very cerebral kind of thing, and then the
mm,
writing, which I think is also it pulls something out of your head in a different way.
mm.
So I think it's finding that sort of again a bit of balance. It's the yin and the yang of that. Hey, there you
Yeah.
go.
Yay.
Yeah.
What kind of workouts are you still do cycling or do you weightlifting
No,
now or?
unfortunately, cycling requires a lot of time, the miles. I am a classic gym rat. We have a nice gym here in our building, and I try to take advantage of that. And I do love to go listen to podcasts and audiobooks when I go, out for walks we have a really nice, park system that's right here.
Mm,
So yeah, take advantage of that.
awesome. Cool. And then the last question would be yeah, language corner. Yay.
Yeah. Um,
Language corner. For me, one phrase, so coming from your first book, and you also mentioned again in this book, the guaipo, the
yeah, yeah.
what the I guess
White
what
Devil
yeah,
Woman.
foreign particularly white woman, sorry, the derogatory term, in there in man, so that's Cantonese, guaipo or guopo, yeah. I'm not sure about the Cantonese pronunciation, but in Mandarin it would be pronounced guipo. And then the term that's commonly used in like Taiwan and China in Mandarin would be like lao wai. Lao wai
Oh,
is just
wow.
like
Yeah.
foreigner. That could be used for men and women. Lao wai.
Okay.
It's the character for like Lao just means old, and then wai means outsider. So lao wai,
Okay.
old outsider. And then another Cantonese term when I was looking this up that came up was like gui lo,
Yeah.
gui lao. Yeah,
Hello. Yeah. I
which
heard
is
that
just a
too. Yeah.
which is
Foreigner,
refers not just, it's
barbarian.
not gender specific, but yeah.
Yeah. Barbarian. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it was always interesting to hear these. Because I've heard Cantonese speaking friends, "Ah, guai lo," like
Yeah. Yeah.
say it, yell it out, or when they're playing video games or something, like as a derogatory term, unfortunately. But yeah, these
Well,
were terms that were used to refer to foreign people
yeah.
in those communities. But
Well, the
anyways,
Japanese use gaijin,
Hmm.
gaijin.
which is kind of neutral, but then there's a character here who also uses the word iteki,
Oh,
barbarian.
oh, Iteki.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so every culture has, I guess every language has that. There's those of us, the inside and the outside, there.
Mm.
But I did come up with a good sort of, you wanted a word from a foreign word. I actually came up with one that we've been using here, and it's not in the
Oh,
book. You ready?
sure.
You ever heard the expression Herkel Durkel?
Hercule
Mm,
Durkle.
no.
Herkel Durkel. It's a
Mm.
Scottish phrase. It means to lie about in bed long after the time you're supposed to get up. So it can be made into a verb when you're herkel-durkeling. And I point this out, and I actually showed the question to my wife earlier today, and I said, I'm going to use herkel-durkel. And I said, because my wife and our dog have they've been perfecting herkel-durkeling. Yes, they're, spending some time in bed after sort of getting up. It's like, oh, here's your coffee. It's like, oh, and then an hour later, she's still on her phone watching it, doing this. And there's the dog curled up right next to her. It's like, man, have a good life there. So herkel-durkel, it's a Scottish word. You should use it in everyday conversation. It's actually a nice idea. It's like, yeah, I could stay in bed for quite a while there, I suppose.
Herkel-durkel.
Herkel-durkel.
Okay. Do you have any Scottish ancestry in your family, or?
Oddly enough, I do, which is crazy. Yeah. So after the last podcast, a couple months after that, my wife and I went on we had delayed our honeymoon. We went to Scotland for 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And so Scotland is lovely. Now, in my family, the myth is my mom was mostly Irish, right? My mom was a redheaded Irish woman from Ohio. Molly is a redheaded Irish woman from Ohio in the books. My mother's name was also Molly. However, when you do the DNA testing, now it comes back with the very specific sort of country of origin kind of things. I'm 16% Scottish, not Irish, Scottish there. So apparently the Scots actually were brought in by the English to colonize parts of Ireland. So it does make sense that there were people that my ancestors had a stopping off point in Ireland, but they were Scottish to Ireland for a generation or several generations, I don't know, and then eventually to the United States. So yes, I am technically Scottish.
Oh, Irish Scottish, or just Scottish, or
just said Scottish,
Scottish.
So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. 16% Scottish.
Wow. Okay.
It was kind of eye-opening. It's like, yeah, I mean, there's the myth in your family. It's like, oh yeah, we're Irish. It's like, okay, right. DNA comes along, apparently not. So.
Awesome. Dan, did you have any phrase or anything you wanted to share? Or
yeah. 旧金山. 旧金山 is the old Mandarin way of saying San Francisco. Gold Mountain.
Gold Mountain, yes. I didn't know I couldn't pronounce the Chinese word, but I have heard, yes, Golden Mountain, yeah.
Yeah, 旧金山.
Like literally old gold mountain.
Gold Mountain, yeah.
Gold Mountain.
Yeah,
because they were going to come here and they were going to get rich and then they were going to go back home.
Yes.
Yeah.
Didn't usually work out that way.
No.
Yeah. No. Well, thank you so much for your time, Peter. It was great chatting with you the second time around. Yeah.
Nice to catch up with you guys too. I'm glad you're both doing well.
Yes.
And, yeah.
And yeah, married now, so yay. Married. The married life. Yeah. It's no more chasing ass, Sorry.
What?
Yeah. Now you can focus on other things like writing or
that's right.
Yeah.
Important stuff.
Important stuff. Yeah. All right. Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll catch you maybe on the third book when it comes around.
I hope so. Cheers.
All right. Cheers. Take care. All right.
Bye.